Hey everyone, welcome to my Affliction Warlock guide. Here, I'll be covering everything I know about Affliction Warlock, such as talents, coven-specific mechanics, stat priority, rotation, and general tips and tricks. Just to clarify, I'm not a Mythic cutting-edge raider, but I have been playing Warlock for over 8 years now, so there could be some discrepancies or some errors, but if I miss anything, or if something isn't correct, please let me know in the comments, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. The first things that we're going to touch on are talents, both single target and multi-target talents. Your talent setup is going to determine what you're good at and what you're going to be a little mediocre at. First, we're going to touch on multi-target or AoE talents. These talents don't differ too far from that of the single target talents, however we do change two very important spells. The first is Absolute Corruption from Siphon Life, and the second is Sow the Seeds from Phantom Singularity. Absolute Corruption increases the damage that your corruption deals from a small flat percentage, and it also makes it so that you no longer have to reapply corruption to the mob that you put it on. This makes it ideal to use in AoE situations, because that way you can use more of your soul shards on casting Malefic Rapture, as opposed to having to reapply Seed of Corruption multiple times throughout the fight. This can save you some soul shards, and it can also increase your damage because you're going to be able to use your primary spender more often. The second is Sow the Seeds. Sow the Seeds is going to make it so that your Seed of Corruption ability will now apply it to 3 targets as opposed to just the 1. This is going to increase your initial burst by a little bit, and it's also going to make sure that you hit all of the mobs in a pack with corruption, and this will also ensure that you're going to deal the most damage in the very beginning of the fight. You could use this and use it multiple times throughout the fight depending on how many monsters are inside of it, but for the most part this is primarily just going to increase your damage as you need to apply Seed of Corruption. In this clip, you're going to notice that I'm going to be using the multiple target setup and the multiple target AoE talents. For the most part, you'll notice that my DPS is relatively competitive with that of the Hunter and the Shaman. I'm generally either first or second DPS in all of the trash packs and the trash fights, but you'll notice that as we reach a boss, my burst is significantly lower than theirs, primarily due to the fact that since I'm geared and oriented for AoE, my single target is going to be lacking more so than if I were to use the single target setup. A very important key takeaway whenever you're choosing to go either AoE or single target, or regardless of whatever content you're doing, the biggest thing that you need to realize with Affliction is that we are a ramp spec, which means that if the mobs don't survive long enough for our dots to tick to their full capacity, we won't be able to deal nearly as much damage than if they lived long enough. So, to kind of put that into some different perspectives, if you're running a heroic dungeon with a bunch of mythic geared players, chances are you're not going to be dealing nearly as much damage as you normally would. You'll notice that you'll deal more damage on the bosses as opposed to, say, the trash packs, because the bosses will actually live just long enough to where your dots can tick just to the end of their expiration. Whenever you're in a higher key or whenever you're in a raid, you'll notice that you do far more damage than in lower keys or in even normals or heroics, primarily due to the length of life that the monsters and the bosses have in that situation. So if you're running lower keys and you're wondering why you're not doing nearly as much damage, there's a very simple answer to that. It's just because those monsters aren't living long enough. The next talent setup we're going to talk about is single target. We're going to swap Absolute Corruption back to Siphon Life. We're going to move Sow the Seeds back to Phantom Singularity. These are going to do a couple of different things for us, especially for single target. Siphon Life is going to give us an additional dot to put onto our target that we want to deal damage to, and it is also going to give us another dot in Phantom Singularity. Both of these talents will allow our Malefic Rapture to hit for more damage on whatever we apply them to. This will include multiple targets. However, the Phantom Singularity is going to deal more damage to our primary target. You'll see this in the next clip where we fight the first boss in Theater of Pain. While we're doing the first pull on this boss, let's go ahead and talk about what's happening. Before we pulled the boss, I used Dark Soul Misery to increase my haste. I then cast Haunt on the first target, followed by Unstable Affliction, Agony, Corruption, and then Siphon Life. Once I did that, I applied Agony, Corruption, and Siphon Life on the other 2 targets, used Phantom Singularity on my primary, and then I used my Covenant ability, immediately followed by Dark Glare. This is going to increase our damage for all of our abilities because it's going to prolong their duration, and this also allows me to dump all of my Soul Shards into Malefic Rapture. As you can see, the damage that I'm putting out is going to be a little more exaggerated because it's 3 targets versus 1, but the same rotation is going to apply for all of them since it is primarily just a single boss fight. However, this does put forth the main idea that for the most part, Affliction is going to be really well and excel in council fights. A council fight is any boss fight that has 3 or more primary targets that are not additional monsters that they spawn in. So since there are 3 bosses on this fight, it is a council fight, whereas if it is 2 bosses, it's generally just a multi-target or cleave situation where destruction will actually outperform you. The next thing we're going to touch on are Soulbinds and Conduits. Overall, most of the covens are pretty close to each other in damage output and throughput, so you'll be able to choose what you like the look of most. But for Conduits, you'll find that, at least for Affliction, one of the more readily available conduits that we can get access to is called Focused Malignancy. This causes our Malefic Rapture to deal increased damage to targets suffering from unstable affliction, which will increase both our AoE and our single target damage. Currently, as it stands, on December 13th, we won't be able to get very many more conduits in our trees, but mostly because we can't flesh it out nearly as much as we will be able to later on in the expansion. But this early, we should be able to do pretty alright with the Malefic Rapture Focused Malignancy conduit. Once we get to the point where we can fill our trees out more, I may make a secondary video touching on just conduits on what I'm using in raid and dungeons, but for now, this is about as long as this particular section is going to be. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is stat priority. Stat priority directly determines which stats are desirable for our specialization and class based on various reasons. For Affliction Warlocks, we want Mastery first, Haste second. The reason why we want Mastery is because Mastery is going to directly influence how much damage our damage over time spells deal, and the reason why we want Haste is because it's going to determine how often our spells deal damage. The higher our Haste, the more often our spells will deal damage, and the higher our Mastery, the harder that those spells will hit. This is why we want higher Mastery and higher Haste. If we use the Blood Mallet data that I'm showing on the screen now, they suggest to have 780 Mastery and 585 Haste. If you have around those numbers, you should hit roughly 6.5 thousand DPS. Roughly. Now do keep in mind, every class and every specialization has their own stat priorities, even within the own class. So, Demonology is going to have a different stat priority than Affliction, and Destruction is going to have a different stat priority than Demonology. Sometimes they're the same, but sometimes they're different, so it's very important for you to do your own research and figure out which one is going to be more desirable for the class and specialization that you wish to play. Now we're going to talk about rotations and openers. Affliction Warlock doesn't really have any set rotation of spells that they have to cast in order, similar to other classes. But instead, they have an opener and what is known as a priority list of spells that they have to maintain. As a damage over time class, they have to make sure that their dots don't fall off of the target to maximize their DPS, very similar to Shadow Priest. As for the opener is going to remain the same by and large, regardless of whether or not you're talented for AoE or single target. So let's start with that. Your opener for any boss is going to be Dark Soul Misery, Haunt, Unstable Affliction, Agony, Corruption, Siphon Life, Phantasmal Singularity, your Coven ability, Dark Glare, and then Malefic Rapture. Obviously, as we go into AoE spec, we might not have Siphon Life or Phantasmal Singularity, so you can remove those from the duration or from the list entirely, and this will make it a little bit easier for you to understand. Overall, What this opener does is it sets us up for the maximum amount of damage that we can deal in the beginning of the boss fight. Once the opener is laid down, we can start working on priority maintenance. What this means is that some spells will start to run out of duration, and it's your job to maintain them by reapplying them. Your main focus is to make sure that Agony does not fall off of the target, and that Unstable Affliction also does not fall off the target. This will increase your damage throughout the fight, and it will also make sure that you're dealing the most damage throughout the fight as you possibly can. Whenever Agony falls off of the target, you start to deal less damage because you have to reapply it and wait for it to ramp back up to 10 stacks. This can cause some detrimental effects to your overall damage because you have to wait for that ramp up again, when if you had reapplied it, you'd still be dealing more and the same amount of damage as if you had dropped it several times throughout the fight. Ideally, you should be aiming for 100% or close to 100% uptime on your main dots, so Agony, Corruption, Siphon Life if you're spec'd into it, and Unstable Affliction. If you can maintain at least 90 to 95% uptime on those spells, you're doing pretty well. As for the other buffs, such as Haunt or Dark Glare, you're going to use those as they come up. This is going to perpetuate your damage, and it's going to allow you to deal more damage throughout the fight than if you didn't use them on cooldown. While we're talking about maintainable debuffs, let's touch on Shadow Embrace for a moment. Shadow Embrace is an Affliction Warlock passive that makes it so that you can stack a debuff onto a target using Shadow Bolt, Drain Soul, and Haunt. This debuff will increase the damage you deal to that target by 3, 6, and 9% based on how many stacks you have on them. The reason why this is at the end of the rotations and openers section is for a pretty simple reason. If you can't maintain at least 90 to 95% uptime on your other dots, you won't be able to maintain a reasonable uptime on this debuff because it only lasts for 12 seconds and is only applied whenever you cast Drain Soul or Haunt. Due to this, if you focus too much on maintaining your Shadow Embrace stacks, you may miss a dot here and there, more so becoming a burden on your damage than a boon. Because of this, I would highly recommend that you maintain or get to the point where you can maintain 90 to 95% uptime on Agony, Corruption, Siphon Life, etc. before you start worrying about making sure you can maintain 3 stacks of Shadow Embrace on the target. Finally, we're going to be talking about general tips and tricks. This section isn't going to be nearly as long as any of the other ones, primarily because a lot of it is just kind of trial and error in learning how to play the class. Some of these tips and tricks will be applicable to other classes and specializations, but for the most part it's going to be Warlock specific. The first one is to remember to use your Demonic Circle and Demonic Gateway to help free up movement time to cast more spells. As with any caster, your primary goal is to always be casting or following your ABCs. Any inactivity or downtime in a fight, unless you cannot cast any other ability during it, such as during an immunity phase, is going to be detrimental to your DPS, especially if that time could be filled by channeling Drain Soul, reapplying a damage over time spell, or by using Malefic Rapture. Second is using your cooldowns liberally and often. This is going to increase your damage on all ranges of gameplay, from trash fights to elite mobs to bosses. The only time that you should hold on to cooldowns is when you need to hold on to it for a burst window. An example of a burst window is during a boss fight where you will lust a specific percentage of health, and you have your cooldowns before that burst window. So if you're fighting a boss and you lust at 30%, but you're a few percentage away from that and you still have cooldowns, wait until that lust phase, and then you'll be able to deal more damage than if you had used them prior. The next one is just kind of maintaining your knowledge of where your cooldowns are. If you don't know where your cooldowns are or what timers they're on, then you may not be able to use them effectively. So you should know the cooldowns of your abilities, and at the very least of your cooldowns. This can help you improve your DPS drastically, and it can make for phenomenal improvements. And I know this was in the rotation and openers section, but 100% you should be working on maintaining 100% uptime on your dots, because that is going to help you immensely in making sure that you're dealing more damage. If you're unsure of what your uptime is, you can download an add-on called Details. This add-on is going to be a damage meter. It's what you see in all of my videos and during my streams. If you click on your character's name in details, you can compare what your abilities' uptimes are, and you can even compare them versus other warlocks or other classes with dots, such as feral druids or shadow priests. Remember, the higher your uptime on your damage over time spells, the more you're going to see your damage go up. And finally, this is really just in general, but overall, in the grand scheme of things, you're not going to be very good at the class unless you play it. If you don't play your class very often, you're going to be worse off than someone who plays nothing but that class. If you see me playing the class and you want to do the same amount of numbers, or you want to do the same things that I do, you have to play it. I've played Warlock for about 8 years, and so I kind of know the class inside and out. If you just pick up the class, you cannot be expected to understand all of the intricacies of the class, and that's okay. Playing it and practicing is going to get you better than if you never do. To close, let's touch on some things that are very important to remember throughout your Warlock experience. Warlocks, especially Affliction Warlocks, are going to be a ramp class. This means that you're going to deal more damage the longer that whatever you're attacking lives. Now, if you kill things very quickly, you're going to deal less damage than what you normally do. If this happens, don't be discouraged. Generally, you'll see that a lot of times in my single target spec, I don't deal a lot of AoE damage, but I generally kill the boss pretty quickly. In that regard, if I run AoE, you'll notice that my boss damage is a little lackluster, but I deal quite a bit of multi-target damage. Due to this, a large majority of players may find that they don't like Affliction Warlock because they're too one-sided in the sense that they have to choose what they're good at. If you don't want to change your talents, or if you just want to be good at one thing, then you should definitely stick with single target, because that way you'll be able to blow up the more important adds and trash mobs, and you'll also be able to deal decent damage to the bosses in general. If I missed anything in this guide, please let me know. Or alternatively, if you guys would like anything else in terms of information or tips and tricks, or you just want my take on how the class is performing, also let me know. I'll go over a lot of the general guides on the class and other specializations for Warlock soon, but for now we're just going to stick with Affliction Warlock. I'm going to put together a Demonology guide next, and then a Destruction guide after that. As for Legendaries, I am going to cover Legendaries in a separate video altogether, because those deserve their own video more or less. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please, if you enjoyed the content, leave a like, subscribe, and come hop into the stream every now and again. We usually stream every weekday and Saturday from 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time to 10 p.m. Central Standard Time. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening, and I'll talk to you guys next time.